The candle was still burning when she finished reading his letter. The wax had begun to melt unevenly, sliding down the side in slow, quiet tears. Outside the tall palace windows, the night sat heavy over London, silent except for the distant rumble of carriage wheels fading into darkness. She held the paper in both hands, her eyes tracing his words again and again, as if afraid they might disappear. She was the most powerful woman in the world, a queen, and yet, in this moment, she was simply a young woman in love. She closed her eyes and pressed the letter gently against her chest. She did not know then how much that love would change her life. She did not know how deeply it would shape history itself. And she certainly did not know how much it would one day break her heart. This is the love story of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, a story often remembered for its devotion, its tenderness, and its quiet strength. A story that unfolded behind palace walls, beneath heavy crowns, and inside two hearts that found each other in a world that rarely allowed rulers to be human. It began long before she was queen. Victoria was born on a quiet morning in May of 1819. She was small, fragile, and not expected to become anything more than a minor royal child. At the time, there were many people ahead of her in the line of succession. Kings, uncles, cousins. No one imagined that this tiny baby girl would one day sit on the throne of the British Empire. Her father died when she was only a baby. She grew up without him, raised by her mother in a strict and controlled environment. Her childhood was lonely. She was rarely allowed to play freely. She was watched constantly, guided constantly, prepared constantly. Even as a child, she understood that her life did not belong entirely to her. She once wrote in her diary, in careful, young handwriting, that she often felt alone. She had toys. She had tutors. She had servants. But she did not have freedom, and she did not yet have him. Prince Albert was born that same year, in 1819, in a small German duchy called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His world was different from Victoria's, but it carried its own quiet sadness. His parents' marriage was troubled. There were arguments. There was distance. There was pain that children could feel even when no one spoke of it. Albert grew up serious, thoughtful, gentle. He loved music. He loved learning. He loved order. He was not loud. He was not careless. He was someone who felt things deeply. As children, they lived separate lives in separate countries under separate skies. But their families had already begun to imagine their future. Their uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, believed they were perfect for each other. He saw something in them, something that might fit. He began to write letters. He began to plan. Victoria first met Albert when she was 17. She remembered it clearly. He was handsome, but not in a proud way. His eyes were kind. His voice was calm. He spoke gently. He listened carefully. She felt comfortable with him. Something about him made her feel seen, not as a future queen, but as herself. Still, life moved on, and everything changed 1 year later. In 1837, Victoria woke early in the morning to the sound of footsteps outside her room. There was urgency in the air. A knock came at her door. She opened it to find the Archbishop and Lord Conyngham standing before her. Their faces were pale. Their voices were quiet. The king was dead, and she was now Queen Victoria. She was only 18 years old. She later wrote that she felt calm in that moment. Calm, but aware that her life had changed forever. She was no longer a girl. She was a queen. The weight of that crown was invisible, but she could feel it. Every decision she made mattered. Every word she spoke mattered. Every person she trusted mattered, including him. Albert returned to her life in 1839. This time, things were different. She was no longer a princess meeting a cousin. She was the Queen of England. And yet, when she saw him again, her heart responded in the same quiet way. She wrote in her diary that he was beautiful. She wrote that she loved him more than she could explain. But there was something unusual about their situation. Because she was the queen, she was the one who had to propose. And she did. She asked him to marry her. He said yes. It was not a political arrangement. It was not forced. It was love. Their wedding took place in February 1840. It was cold outside, but inside the chapel there was warmth. She wore white. He stood beside her, and together, they stepped into a life neither of them could fully imagine. At first, it was not easy. Albert struggled to find his place. He was the husband of the Queen, but he had no real power. Some people distrusted him because he was German. Some people thought he did not belong. Victoria saw his pain. She saw his effort. She saw his heart, and she stood beside him. Slowly, he became more than her husband. He became her partner, her advisor, her closest friend. They spent hours together, talking, walking, reading, laughing. They built a family. They built a life. They built a love that felt safe. She depended on him more than anyone knew. He helped her with her duties. He helped her with her fears. He helped her carry the crown. Their love story became part of history. People saw them as an example, a queen and her prince, a marriage built not on duty alone, but on real affection. But behind the smiles and portraits, life was not always peaceful. Victoria had a strong temper. Albert had strong opinions. They argued. They disagreed. They hurt each other. And yet, they always found their way back. Because love, for them, was not about perfection. It was about choosing each other again and again. Years passed. Children were born, 9 in total. Their home was filled with noise, with life, with chaos. Albert was a devoted father. Victoria was a devoted mother, though she sometimes struggled with the demands of family and crown. Still, they remained close, until the day everything began to change. It started quietly, as many tragedies do. A cough, a fever, a weakness that did not go away. At first, no one was too worried. But Victoria could feel something was wrong. She watched him carefully. She listened to his breathing at night. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes. And she was afraid. Afraid in a way she had never been before. Because for the first time since she became queen, she faced the possibility of losing the one person she could not live without. She sat beside him, holding his hand, listening to the slow rhythm of his breath. She whispered to him. She prayed for him. She begged the world not to take him away. But history does not always listen to prayers. And on a cold December day in 1861, everything stopped. Victoria stood there, silent, still, as the reality settled around her. The man who had been her strength, her comfort, her love, was gone. And in that moment, the Queen of England became something else entirely. A woman with a broken heart. But what happened next would shock the entire empire. Because Victoria would never be the same again. She would retreat. She would disappear. She would mourn him in ways no one expected. And her grief would become one of the most powerful and haunting chapters in royal history. But that part of the story had not yet begun. Because before the silence, before the darkness, before the loss, there was still love. And love, as Victoria would soon learn, could change everything, even a queen. In the early years of their marriage, there were mornings when Victoria would wake before Albert and simply watch him sleep. The room would still be dim, the curtains barely touched by the first light of dawn. His face, usually so serious during the day, softened in sleep. His breathing was slow and steady, peaceful. In those quiet moments, he did not look like a prince. He looked like hers. She once wrote that she felt happiest when he was beside her, when there were no advisors, no ministers, no red boxes filled with government papers waiting for her attention. Just the two of them, sharing silence. Albert, too, found comfort in those private hours. He had entered a world where he was constantly judged. Some saw him as an outsider. Some saw him as unnecessary. Others feared he would try to control the queen. But Victoria knew the truth. Albert did not want to control her. He wanted to protect her. He began to help her organize her work, not by force, but by quiet support. He would sit with her in the evenings, reading through documents. He would explain things carefully. He would listen when she was frustrated. Sometimes she resisted him. Victoria was strong-willed. She had ruled alone before him. She was not used to sharing responsibility. There were nights when their voices rose behind closed doors. Moments when pride stood between them. Moments when she reminded him that she was the queen. And moments when he withdrew into silence, wounded more deeply than he showed. But time and again, something gentler would return. An apology, a touch of the hand, a look that said more than words could. Their love was not perfect. It was real. Outside the palace, the world was changing quickly. The British Empire was growing. Cities were expanding. Smoke from factories filled the sky. New inventions were transforming daily life. Albert was fascinated by progress. He believed the future could be better. He believed in education, in science, in improvement. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, planning exhibitions, supporting new ideas, encouraging innovation. Victoria watched him with admiration. She saw his passion. She saw his purpose. And she loved him more for it. But there were also quiet costs. Albert pushed himself too hard. He rarely rested. He carried pressure inside him, hidden behind calm eyes and polite smiles. Victoria noticed it sometimes. A tiredness, a distance. She would ask if he was well. He would always say yes. He did not want to worry her. Years passed like pages turning. Their children grew. The palace changed with them. There were toys scattered in hallways. Laughter echoing through rooms that had once been silent. Small footsteps running where careful royal steps had always walked. Albert was happiest with his children. He would kneel beside them, teach them, guide them. He wanted them to grow not just as royals, but as good people. Victoria watched these moments with quiet emotion. She saw not a prince. She saw a father, and she loved him even more deeply for it. But being parents also brought strain. Victoria struggled with pregnancy and recovery. She sometimes felt overwhelmed, sometimes distant. There were days when she felt lost inside her own life. Albert tried to help. He tried to understand. But there were things he could not fix. Still, they held on to each other. Because in a world that demanded so much from them, they were each other's safe place. One evening, after a long day filled with meetings and responsibilities, they walked together in the palace gardens. The air was cool. The sky was fading into soft shades of orange and blue. Victoria slipped her hand into his. For a while, they said nothing. They did not need to. Finally, she spoke. She told him she did not know how she could do any of this without him. Albert looked at her, surprised by the sudden emotion in her voice. He squeezed her hand gently, and he told her she would never have to. She believed him. She believed they had time. So much time. But time is a way of moving quietly, unnoticed, unstoppable. As the years continued, Albert began to change in small ways. It was nothing obvious at first. He tired more easily. He grew thinner. Sometimes he would sit in silence, his thoughts far away. Victoria noticed. She always noticed. She asked him again if he was well. Again, he told her yes. He smiled, but his smile did not reach his eyes the same way. In public, they remained the image of strength. The queen and her prince, side by side, unshaken. But in private, Victoria began to feel something she could not explain. A quiet fear, the kind that arrives without reason, the kind that sits in your chest and refuses to leave. She found herself watching him more closely, listening more carefully, holding his hand longer than before, as if some part of her already knew, already understood. One night, she woke suddenly. The room was dark. Albert was sitting at the edge of the bed. He was awake. Still, she asked him what was wrong. He hesitated. Then he said he could not sleep. She sat up beside him. She rested her head against his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They just sat there together. Two people who loved each other deeply. Two people who did not know how fragile their happiness truly was. Outside, the wind moved softly against the palace walls. Inside, time moved forward, and somewhere in the quiet space between heartbeats, the future was already beginning to change. At first, the changes were so small that no one else would have noticed them. Albert still attended his meetings. He still dressed carefully each morning. He still walked beside Victoria in public, his posture straight, his expression calm. To everyone watching, he looked the same as he always had. But Victoria saw the truth in the quiet moments. She saw in the way he paused at the top of the stairs, just for a second, before continuing down. She saw it in the way he sometimes pressed his fingers against his temples, as if trying to push away an invisible weight. She saw it in his eyes, which carried a tiredness that sleep did not seem to fix. She did not speak of her fear. Not yet. Instead, she stayed close to him. Their lives remained full. There were still royal duties. still ceremonies, still endless responsibilities that came with the British crown. The empire stretched across oceans, and every decision made inside the palace walls carried consequences far beyond what either of them could see. Albert had become more involved than ever before. He believed deeply in his role. He believed he was there for a reason. He worked on projects that he hoped would improve the future. He supported education. He encouraged new inventions. He spoke about progress in a way that made people listen. Some admired him for it. Others did not. There were still whispers, still voices that reminded him he was not born in Britain, that he was an outsider. Victoria hated those whispers. She could not understand how anyone could doubt him. She saw his heart. She saw his loyalty. She saw the quiet sacrifices he made every single day. Sometimes, late at night, she would find him alone at his desk, papers spread out before him, his face pale in the candlelight. She would walk to him and place her hand gently on his shoulder. He would look up at her and smile, but she could see how much effort it took. "You must rest," she would tell him softly. He would nod, but he rarely did. In those years, they also began spending more time away from London. The noise of the city had become exhausting. The constant attention, the constant pressure, the constant watching eyes. They found peace in the countryside. At Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, everything felt different. The air was softer there. The days moved more slowly. They could walk without crowds. They could sit together without interruption. It was there in those quiet spaces that Victoria felt closest to him. They would walk along the shoreline, the sound of the waves steady and calm. Sometimes they spoke about their children, sometimes about the future, sometimes about nothing at all, and sometimes they simply walked in silence. Those silences were never empty. They were full of understanding, full of love. But even there, the shadow remained. Albert would grow tired more quickly than before. He would sit down to rest while Victoria remained standing, watching him with careful eyes. He always told her not to worry. He always said he was fine. She wanted to believe him. More than anything, she wanted to believe him. But there were moments when she caught him looking at her in a way that frightened her, as if he were memorizing her face, as if he were holding on to something he was afraid of losing. She never asked him why. She was afraid of the answer. Beyond their private world, there were other pressures building. Their eldest son, Bertie, had begun to grow into a young man. Albert worried about him constantly. He believed Bertie was not ready, not disciplined enough, not serious enough. He pushed him harder. He demanded more from him. Victoria watched these moments unfold with quiet concern. She saw how much Albert carried inside himself, not just as a husband, not just as a father, but as a man trying to prepare the future, trying to protect something he might not always be there to guide. The stress weighed on him, even when he did not show it, even when he smiled. One evening, as autumn settled over the countryside, Victoria and Albert sat together near a window. Outside, the trees were losing their leaves. The sky was gray. Albert had been unusually quiet all day. Victoria held her sewing in her lap, though she had not touched it for some time. She was watching him. He was staring out at the distance, his expression unreadable. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. He did not answer right away. For a long moment, he simply watched the empty landscape. Then he said very softly, "Time moves faster than we think." Victoria felt a chill pass through her. She did not know why those words unsettled her so deeply. She reached for his hand. His fingers were colder than she expected. He noticed her reaction and gave her a reassuring smile, but did not erase the feeling growing inside her chest. That quiet fear, that quiet knowing. In the weeks that followed, the distance between moments of happiness and moments of worry grew smaller. Some days were bright, filled with laughter, filled with life. Other days were heavy, filled with silence, filled with things neither of them could say out loud. Victoria began writing more in her diary. She wrote about him constantly, about his kindness, about his strength, about her love for him. It was as if she needed to capture every moment, as if she needed proof that it was real, that he was real, that he was still there, because somewhere deep inside her, there was a voice she could not ignore, a voice that whispered that nothing lasted forever. She pushed that voice away. She focused on the present, on his hand in hers, on his voice beside her, on his presence filling the spaces of her life. But the future was still coming, slowly, quietly, and neither of them could stop it. One night, as the palace slept, Victoria woke again. She turned toward him. For a moment, she simply listened, to his breathing, to the fragile rhythm that had become the center of her world. She reached out and placed her hand over his. She held it there, as if holding it tightly enough could keep everything from changing, as if love alone could hold back time. Outside, the darkness stretched endlessly. Inside, the queen lay awake, listening, waiting, and wondering how much longer things would stay the same. Winter began to settle in slowly that year, not with sudden storms, but with a creeping cold that seemed to slip through the palace walls and into everything it touched. Victoria felt it most in the mornings. She would wake and see the frost clinging to the edges of the windows, delicate and silent. The world outside looked pale and distant. Inside, the rooms felt larger than before, quieter. Albert had always risen early. He had always been the first to begin the day. But now, there were mornings when he remained in bed just a little longer. Not asleep, just still. He would say he was thinking. Victoria never asked about what. She was afraid those thoughts might take him somewhere she could not follow. He had begun coughing more often. It was not violent, not alarming, just enough to be noticed, just enough to leave behind a silence afterward that lingered too long. The doctors were called, of course. They spoke in calm voices. They used careful words. They said he was tired, overworked. They said he needed rest. Rest. It sounded simple. But Victoria knew Albert. Rest was not something he allowed himself easily. Even when his body slowed, his mind did not. One afternoon, she found him standing alone in one of the long palace corridors. He was holding onto the back of a chair, his head lowered slightly. She froze for a moment, watching him. He looked smaller somehow, not in size, but in strength. She walked toward him quickly, trying to hide the fear rising inside her. He straightened when he heard her footsteps. He smiled, that same gentle smile he had given her for so many years. "I am quite all right," he said before she could speak. She nodded. She did not trust her voice. He reached for her hand, and she felt again how cool his fingers had become. She wrapped her other hand around his, trying to warm it, trying to hold him there, trying to keep him anchored beside her. But beyond the palace walls, other troubles were unfolding. Their son, Bertie, had become a source of deep worry. Albert had always believed that his eldest son needed discipline, guidance, strength. He believed the future of the monarchy depended on it. But Bertie was different. He was social, restless, easily distracted by the pleasures of youth. News reached Albert that Bertie had been careless, that he had not lived up to the expectations placed upon him. Victoria saw the change in Albert immediately. The disappointment cut deeply, not just as a father, but as a man who feared he was running out of time to prepare his son. Albert decided he must speak to him personally. The journey was not long, but the weather had turned cold and wet. Victoria begged him to wait. She told him he was not well enough. She told him it could be done another time. But Albert was firm. He believed it was his duty, and duty had always come before comfort. She stood at the window as his carriage disappeared into the gray distance. A feeling of dread settled over her. She could not explain it. She only knew she wanted him to come back. Soon, safe, unchanged. When he returned, he looked exhausted, more exhausted than she had ever seen him before. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. He told her the journey had been difficult. He told her the conversation with Bertie had been necessary. But he did not speak of the toll it had taken on him. That night, his cough worsened. Victoria sat beside him. She refused to leave. She watched every breath, every movement, every small sign. The doctors came again. Their calm voices returned, their careful words. But this time, Victoria heard something else beneath them. Uncertainty. They could not promise her anything. Albert remained calm. Even now, even as his strength seemed to slip quietly away. He would reach for her hand. He would look at her with that same steady love, as if he were trying to comfort her, as if her pain mattered more to him than his own. Days passed. The palace grew quieter. Servants walked softly. Doors closed gently. Everyone seemed to understand that something fragile was unfolding. Victoria barely slept. She barely ate. Her world had narrowed to a single room, to a single bed, to a single man. Sometimes he would sleep. Sometimes he would wake and speak to her in a soft voice. They spoke of small things, memories, their children, moments that had filled their lives with meaning. He told her things he had never said before, not because he had hidden them, but because there had always been time. Until now, one evening, as the light faded early into darkness, he asked her to sit beside him. She took his hand. She could feel how weak it had become. He looked at her for a long time, as if he were trying to memorize her. Every detail, every line, every piece of her. She felt tears fill her eyes. She tried to hide them. She wanted to be strong. For him, he lifted his hand slowly and touched her cheek. The gesture was so gentle, it broke her heart. She leaned into him. She wanted to stop time. She wanted to stay in that moment forever. But time did not stop. It never had. Outside, the cold night deepened. Inside, Victoria listened to his breathing. It was softer now, more fragile. She held his hand tighter, as if she could hold him here by force of love alone. But deep inside, a terrible question had begun to form, one she did not want to ask, one she did not want answered. She sat there in the dim light, listening, waiting, hoping, and fearing that the next breath might change everything. The days that followed no longer felt like normal days. They felt suspended, as if the world outside continued moving while Victoria remained trapped inside a single, fragile moment. The palace clocks still ticked. The servants still carried out their duties. Letters still arrived from ministers and officials across the British Empire, each one marked urgent, each one demanding the attention of the Queen. But Victoria could not focus on any of them. Her place was beside Albert, always beside him. She had begun to notice how everyone else behaved around her. Their voices were softer. Their eyes avoided hers when they could. They bowed, they nodded, but there was something else behind their careful respect. Fear, not fear of her. Fear of what might happen if Prince Albert did not recover. Because Albert was no longer just her husband. He had become part of the strength of the British monarchy itself. He had helped guide decisions. He had helped shape the future. Without him, there was an emptiness no one knew how to fill. Victoria felt that emptiness already forming. It lived inside her chest. It followed her even when she stepped briefly into the hallway for air. It waited for her when she returned to his bedside. One afternoon, she stood at the window of the room, watching the gray sky stretch endlessly over the palace grounds. The trees stood bare, their branches thin and lifeless in the winter cold. She remembered another winter years ago, a happier one. Albert had insisted they walk outside despite the cold. She had complained at first, wrapping herself tightly in her coat, but he had laughed softly and taken her hand. He had told her the cold made people feel alive. She had not understood then. Now she understood too well. Behind her, she could hear his breathing, uneven, too quiet. She turned back quickly, as if afraid he might disappear when she wasn't looking. He was still there, but he looked distant, as if part of him was already somewhere else. Their daughter, Vicky, had arrived earlier that day. She stood at the foot of the bed, watching her father with wide, frightened eyes. She tried to be brave. She tried to smile when he looked at her. But Victoria saw the truth. Their children were beginning to understand. The strong, steady figure who had always been there suddenly seemed fragile. Human. Temporary. Albert spoke to Vicky gently. He asked about her journey. He asked about her children. His voice was weak, but his mind was still sharp. Victoria listened carefully. She wondered how he could still think of others when he was suffering. That was who he had always been. Selfless. Even now, after Vicky left the room, Victoria sat beside him again. She could feel the silence pressing in on her. There were things she wanted to say, things she needed to say, but the words refused to come, because speaking them would make everything real. In another part of the palace, the royal household carried on with quiet tension. Servants whispered to one another in corners. Advisors waited for news they could not ask for directly. Doctors came and went, their expressions carefully controlled. Each of them understood what was at stake. Not just a life, but the future of the royal family. The future of Queen Victoria herself, because those who knew her best understood something else. Victoria did not simply love Albert. She depended on him, emotionally, mentally, completely. He had become her center. Without him, there was no clear path forward. Albert himself seemed aware of this. At times, when he looked at her, there was something in his eyes that felt like apology, as if he were sorry for something he could not control. One evening, as the light faded into shadow, he spoke her name softly. She leaned close immediately. "I am here," she whispered. He studied her face. His eyes moved slowly, as if memorizing every detail. "You must be strong," he said quietly. The words sent a wave of fear through her. She shook her head. "You will be strong," she answered quickly. "You will recover." He did not argue, but he did not agree. He simply held her hand. That silence said more than words ever could. Beyond the walls of the palace, the British public remained unaware of how serious things had become. They still saw portraits of the royal couple, still believed in the image of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert as the symbol of stability and love. They did not see the private suffering. They did not hear the quiet coughing in the night. They did not see the Queen sitting awake until morning, afraid to close her eyes. Victoria had begun to notice how time behaved differently now. Each minute stretched endlessly when she watched him sleep. Yet entire days disappeared without meaning when she tried to remember them later. Everything blurred together. Hope, fear, love, exhaustion. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, she allowed herself to imagine the worst. She imagined waking up and finding his hand cold. She imagined the stillness, the silence, the absence. The thought was unbearable. She would immediately reach for him, just to feel his warmth, just to remind herself he was still there, still hers, still part of her world. Albert stirred slightly beside her. His eyes opened. For a moment, he looked confused. Then he saw her, and he smiled. That smile still had the power to calm her, even now, even as everything else felt like it was slipping away. She leaned forward and rested her head gently beside him. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say, only something left to lose. Outside, the night stretched on. Inside, the Queen of England held the hand of the man she loved more than her crown. And somewhere, deep inside her, she could feel it, the quiet, approaching moment that would test her love, her strength, and her place in history forever. The room had begun to feel smaller, though nothing in it had changed. The same curtains hung beside the tall windows. The same fireplace burned quietly, its warmth barely touching the cold that lived inside Victoria now. The same chair stood beside his bed, where she had been sitting for so many hours that she no longer remembered what it felt like to sit anywhere else. Albert slept more often, or at least his eyes stayed closed. Sometimes she wondered if he truly slept, or if he simply did not have the strength to open them. She watched every breath. She counted them without meaning to. Each one felt like a promise that had to be protected. Each pause between them felt too long, too dangerous. The doctors still came. They checked his pulse. They spoke in low voices near the door. They used words meant to comfort, but their faces betrayed them. Victoria had learned to read faces long ago. She knew when someone was hiding the truth. One of the younger doctors avoided looking at her entirely. That frightened her more than anything else. Albert had always been the one who gave certainty to others. He had always been the calm center in moments of confusion. Ministers trusted him. The royal household relied on him. Even Victoria herself had leaned on him more times than she could count. Now, there was no certainty, only waiting, and waiting was its own kind of pain. News from outside the palace continued to arrive. Boxes of papers were delivered each morning, tied neatly with ribbon, filled with matters of state, trade agreements, military reports, political disputes. The endless machinery of the British Empire did not stop. It could not stop. She knew she was expected to read them, to respond, to rule. But every time she tried, the words blurred together. They felt distant, unimportant. How could anything matter more than this room? More than him? One afternoon, Lord Palmerston himself requested an audience. He stood before her with careful posture, his voice respectful but firm. He reminded her of her duties. He spoke of responsibility. He spoke of the nation watching. Victoria listened in silence. She understood what he was saying, but he did not understand what she was losing. After he left, she returned to Albert immediately. She sat beside him and took his hand. She wondered how the world could continue asking things of her while he lay there, fading piece by piece. Albert opened his eyes slowly. He saw her. His fingers tightened weakly around hers. "You must not neglect your work," he whispered. She felt tears fill her eyes. "My work is here," she said softly. He looked at her with a mixture of love and sadness, as if he knew she would say that, as if he wished she would not. Their children came and went in quiet visits. Each one carried their own version of fear. Their son Bertie came last. He stood near the door at first, hesitant. Albert had always been strict with him, demanding, expecting more. Now, Bertie looked like a boy again, uncertain. He approached slowly. Albert looked at him carefully. There was no anger in his eyes now, only something softer, something deeper. Bertie's voice trembled when he spoke. He told his father he was sorry. Sorry for disappointing him. Sorry for everything. Victoria watched Albert's face. She saw the emotion there. Albert lifted his hand slightly. Bertie took it. For a moment, nothing else existed in that room. Not the crown, not the empire, only a father and his son. Victoria turned away quietly, giving them privacy, but she could still hear their voices. Low, fragile, human. Later, when Bertie left, Victoria saw something in Albert's expression she had not seen before. Peace. But peace frightened her. Peace felt like acceptance, and acceptance felt like goodbye. That night, the palace felt impossibly silent. Even the usual sounds had faded. Victoria sat beside him, as always. Her body ached from exhaustion, but she refused to rest. She feared what might happen if she did. Albert stirred again. His voice was weaker now. He spoke her name. She leaned close immediately. He studied her face for a long time. "You have given me great happiness," he whispered. Her heart broke at those words. She shook her head, tears falling freely now. "No," she said. "You must not speak like that." He reached for her hand again. His touch was so light, so fragile. She held it tightly, afraid he might slip away if she loosened her grip. Outside, the wind moved against the windows. Inside, time felt like it was slowing, stretching, breaking. Victoria realized she was afraid of the morning, afraid of what it might bring, afraid of what it might take. She rested her head beside him carefully. She listened and breathed. She whispered to him. She told him she loved him. She told him she needed him. She told him he could not leave her. But there was no answer, only the quiet rise and fall of his chest. And even that felt uncertain now. Somewhere deep inside her, she felt it. The approaching moment. The moment that would separate her life into two parts. Before and after. She did not know who she would be in that after. She did not know how a queen ruled without her prince. She only knew that nothing would ever be the same again. And still, she waited, holding his hand, listening, hoping, as the longest night of her life continued without end. The night refused to end. Victoria had stopped noticing the hours. The candles had burned low and been replaced more than once. The fire had been fed again and again, yet the room never felt warm enough. Everything existed in a fragile stillness, balanced on something she could not see but could feel slipping. Albert's hand rested in hers. It was lighter now, not just weaker, lighter. She remembered that hand as it had once been, strong and steady when he guided her through crowded halls, gentle when he held their newborn children, certain when he placed a ring on her finger so many years ago. Now it lay in her grasp like something she was afraid to break. His breathing had changed again. It came slower, quieter, each breath separated by a silence that stretched too long. Victoria found herself holding her own breath, waiting for his next one, waiting, counting, praying. She had never prayed so much in her life. She prayed without words, without form. She prayed with her heart. Outside the room, the palace existed in suspended motion. Servants stood waiting for instructions that never came. Advisors gathered in quiet corners, speaking in whispers. No one laughed. No one allowed themselves to forget what was happening behind that closed door, because everything depended on it, not just the royal family, but the monarchy itself. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had become more than rulers. They had become symbols, symbols of stability, of devotion, of a royal love story that people believed would last forever. No one knew how fragile forever truly was. Inside the room, Victoria leaned closer. She studied his face. Every line, every shadow. She tried to memorize him, as if memory alone could hold him here. Albert's eyes opened slowly. For a moment, they seemed unfocused. Then they found her. Even now, even through the exhaustion, there was love in them. Always love. He tried to speak. No sound came at first. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. "I am here," she whispered. His lips moved again. This time, she heard it. Her name. Just her name. Nothing more. But it carried everything. Her throat tightened. She wanted to answer, but she was afraid her voice would break. He watched her carefully, as if he understood everything she could not say, as if he knew her fear. His fingers moved weakly in her hand. She tightened her grip, afraid to lose even that small connection. In another part of the palace, their children waited. They sat together, silent. No one spoke, each of them lost in their own thoughts, each of them remembering the man their father had been. Strong, certain, unshakable. It felt impossible that he could be fading, impossible that the future could exist without him. Bertie stood apart from the others. He stared at the floor. He remembered their last conversation, the disappointment, the expectation, the love hidden beneath it. He had always believed there would be more time, more chances. Now he was not sure. The weight of that uncertainty settled heavily on him. Back inside the room, Victoria felt exhaustion pressing in on her. Her body begged for rest. Her mind refused. She could not leave him. Not now. Not ever. A doctor entered quietly. He checked Albert's pulse. His expression remained carefully controlled. But Victoria saw it. She saw the truth he tried to hide. He stepped back slowly. He said nothing. He did not need to. Albert's breathing faltered again. Victoria felt her heart stop with it. She leaned forward urgently, waiting, begging. Then, another breath came. Soft, fragile. But there, she closed her eyes briefly. Relief and terror mixing together. She realized she was living between breaths, between moments, between hope and loss. Albert stirred again. His gaze shifted slightly toward the window. The curtains were still drawn. The world outside remained hidden. Victoria wondered what he was seeing, what he was thinking. Was he remembering their first meeting, their wedding, their children, their life together? She wished she could see inside his mind. She wished she could go there with him. Anywhere, as long as they stayed together. He looked back at her again. His eyes held something new now. Not fear, not pain. Something deeper. Something she could not name. Her heart pounded harder. She felt something coming. Something she could not stop. She leaned closer, her voice barely more than a breath. "Do not leave me." The words escaped before she could stop them. They hung between them. Heavy. Real. Albert's lips parted slightly. He tried to answer, tried to give her something, but his strength was fading too quickly. His hand tightened weakly in hers, then loosened. Victoria's breath caught. She leaned forward urgently. "Albert." Her voice trembled. No answer, only the faint rise and fall of his chest. The room seemed to close in around her. The silence grew louder, the air heavier. She felt the world tilting beneath her. Everything they had built, everything they had been, balanced on this moment, this single fragile thread. She pressed his hand to her cheek. She could still feel warmth, still feel him there. But for how long? Outside, the first faint light of morning began to approach. A new day was coming. Unstoppable, unforgiving. Victoria felt it before she saw it. The end of the night, the end of something else. She held him tighter, as if she could hold back the dawn itself, as if she could stop time, as if love alone could keep him here. And as the darkness slowly began to fade, she waited for what would come next. The light came slowly. It did not rush into the room. It crept forward, pale and cold, touching the edges of the curtains like a quiet warning. Victoria saw it and felt a sudden fear she could not explain. She had spent the whole night holding back the dark, as if darkness itself had been protecting her from something. Now the morning threatened to reveal what the night had hidden. She did not want the morning. She wanted one more hour, one more minute, one more breath. Albert's hand was still in hers. She watched his chest rise gently, then fall. She waited. The pause between each breath seemed longer now. Too long. Her own breathing became uneven, matching his without her realizing. She leaned closer, so close she could feel the faint warmth of his skin. "Albert," she whispered again. His name was no longer just a name. It was a prayer, a plea, a promise. His eyelids moved slightly. For a moment, hope surged inside her, so suddenly it almost hurt. His eyes opened just enough to see her. He did not look confused. He did not look afraid. He looked tired, so very tired. But when he saw her, something softened in his face. Something familiar. Something that had always belonged only to her. His lips moved. She leaned closer, desperate to hear. The sound was faint, almost nothing, but she understood. He was telling her he loved her. The words barely existed in the air, but they existed in his eyes. She felt her heart break and heal at the same time. Tears slipped down her face before she could stop them. She shook her head gently, as if she could refuse what was happening, as if love could still change the ending. Outside the door, footsteps gathered. The doctors had returned. Their faces were pale, serious. They stood quietly, waiting. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted to be the one who marked the moment. Victoria did not look at them. They did not matter. Nothing mattered except him. Albert's breathing faltered again. This time, the pause stretched even longer. Victoria froze. Her fingers tightened around his. She leaned forward urgently, waiting, listening. Then, a breath. Soft, fragile, still there. She closed her eyes in relief. But the relief did not last. She knew now. She could feel it. The space between breaths was growing wider, like the tide pulling away from the shore. Slow, unstoppable. She rested her forehead against his hand. Memories flooded her without warning. His voice on their wedding day, his laughter in the gardens, the way he held their children, the way he said her name when no one else was listening. He had been her partner, her protector, her strength, her home. She realized, with sudden clarity, that she did not know who she was without him. The Queen of England meant nothing in this moment. She was only a wife about to lose her husband. Behind her, one of the doctors stepped closer. She heard him. She felt his presence. She turned her head sharply. Her eyes met his. He did not speak. He did not need to. She saw the truth waiting in his silence. She shook her head. No, not yet. She turned back to Albert. She placed her hand gently against his cheek. His skin was still warm. Still him. "You must stay," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "You must." His breathing came again. Softer, more distant. She wondered if he could still hear her. She hoped he could. She needed him to know. She needed him to carry her love with him wherever he was going. The room was completely silent now. Even the fire seemed to have stilled. Even the world outside seemed to have stopped. Everything waited. Victoria held him as if she could anchor him to this life, as if her touch alone could keep him here. Albert's chest rose once more. Slow, careful, then fell. She waited. Seconds passed. Long, endless seconds. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She could not breathe. She could not move. She could only wait. Then, a faint breath came again, so soft she almost missed it. She let out a broken sob. Hope and despair tangled together inside her. She realized now that hope itself had become painful, because hope meant waiting, and waiting meant losing him piece by piece. His fingers moved slightly in hers. She leaned closer instantly. "Albert." Her voice cracked. His hand did not tighten. It did not fall away. It simply rested there, balanced between holding on and letting go. The light in the room grew stronger. Morning had arrived. Victoria hated it. Morning meant the world would continue. Morning meant nothing would stop. Morning meant she could not hide from the truth any longer. She pressed his hand against her heart. She wanted him to feel it, to know he was still part of her, always part of her. Albert's breathing came again. Barely there. She watched his chest rise. Fall. Waited. Listened. Counted. The doctors stood behind her, silent witnesses to a love story that had shaped a kingdom. A royal love story. A human love story. A love story that had never needed a crown to matter. Victoria did not look away. She would not miss a single moment. Not one breath. Not one heartbeat. She stayed there, holding him, as the morning light filled the room, and as the space between one breath and the next began to feel like forever. Victoria did not realize she had fallen into a kind of trance until the knock came at the door. It was soft, careful, but in the silence of that room, it sounded loud. Too loud. She did not move at first. She was afraid that even the smallest shift might disturb the fragile rhythm of Albert's breathing. She kept her eyes on him, watching his chest rise and fall, as if nothing else in the world existed. The knock came again, this time more urgent. She turned her head slowly. One of the senior attendants stood at the door, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "There's a message, Your Majesty," he said quietly. Victoria felt a flicker of irritation. A message? How could anything matter now? She almost told him to leave, but something in his expression stopped her. Fear. Not personal fear. National fear. She hesitated. Albert's hand rested in hers. Still warm. Still here. She gently lowered his hand onto the blanket and stood, though every part of her resisted leaving his side even for a moment. She stepped toward the door, her body heavy with dread. The attendant handed her a folded paper. "It came from the Foreign Office," he said. She unfolded it slowly. Her eyes scanned the words. At first, they made no sense. Then the meaning settled in. A diplomatic crisis. An incident far across the ocean. British ships. American forces. Anger. Threats. The possibility of war. Victoria felt the room tilt slightly. War. The word echoed in her mind. Britain stood on the edge of something dangerous. And Albert had been deeply involved in these matters. He had advised. He had guided. He had helped prevent conflict before. He understood diplomacy in a way few others did. Her hands trembled. She looked back at him. He lay there so still, so fragile. How could the fate of nations exist in the same moment as this? She dismissed the attendant, closed the door, and stood there, holding the message, alone with an impossible choice. She could let the ministers decide without him. She could protect him from the burden, protect his last strength. Or she could ask him, ask the man who had always helped her carry the weight of the crown. Her heart broke at the thought. She did not want to bring the world into this room. The world did not belong here. But Albert had always believed in duty, always believed his purpose was larger than himself. Slowly, she returned to his bedside. She sat beside him again. She picked up his hand, held it carefully. "Albert," she whispered. His eyelids moved faintly. He heard her. She knew he did. "There is something you must know," she said, her voice trembling. For a moment, she could not continue. She wanted to lie. She wanted to protect him. But she had never lied to him before. Not truly. She would not begin now. "There is trouble," she whispered. "The government, they need you." His breathing shifted slightly. His eyes opened just barely. He looked at her, confused, weak, but listening. She hesitated. Tears filled her eyes. "You must not worry," she said quickly. "It can wait." But even as she said it, she knew it could not. Albert's fingers moved faintly in hers. He understood. He had always understood. His lips parted. He tried to speak. No sound came. She leaned closer. "You must rest," she whispered desperately. "Nothing else matters." But something had changed his eyes. A spark. Faint, but real. Purpose. He tried again. This time, a faint sound escaped. Not words, but effort. Victoria felt fear tighten inside her chest. He was trying to rise, trying to push himself beyond his strength. "No," she said gently. "Please." But Albert was already gathering what little strength he had, because this was who he was. Not just her husband, not just Prince Albert, but a man who believed his duty did not end, even here. Even now, she realized, with sudden clarity, that he was fighting for something more than his life. He was fighting for his country, his family, her. She helped him slightly, supporting him as he struggled to breathe. His hand tightened faintly around hers. His eyes searched her face, as if asking for something. She understood. With shaking hands, she lifted the message, held it where he could see. His eyes moved slowly across the page, reading, understanding. Even now, even here, his breathing grew more strained. She panicked. "This was a mistake," she whispered. "You must stop." But he shook his head faintly. No, he was not finished. He would not leave things unfinished. He gathered another fragile breath. His lips moved. Victoria leaned closer than ever before, desperate to hear, desperate to hold onto every word. His voice came as a faint whisper, so soft she almost missed it. But what he said made her heart stop, because in that moment, Prince Albert was not speaking as a dying man. He was speaking as the man who had helped guide the British Empire, the man who had stood beside Queen Victoria through everything. And as she listened, Victoria realized that whatever he was about to say might change the future forever. Victoria's breath caught as she leaned closer, straining to hear the faint whisper that came from Albert's lips. Each word was a struggle, drawn from the depths of a body weary from illness, but a mind still sharp, still alive with purpose. She could barely make out the syllables, but the meaning pierced her heart like a blade. "Victoria, the treaty," he murmured. His eyes, though glassy with fatigue, held that same resolute light she had always admired. "It must hold." Her hand tightened around his, supporting him as he fought to make himself heard. The room seemed to shrink around them, the world beyond the walls reduced to nothing but the fragile, flickering presence of the man she loved. The Americans, his voice faltered. She steadied him, pressing a gentle finger to his lips to encourage him. "Albert, you don't have to." "No," he whispered fiercely. I cannot not speak." His eyes, pleading yet commanding, drew her into the weight of responsibility he carried so naturally. She realized in that instant that the man lying before her was still more than mortal weakness. He was a force that had shaped nations, that had tempered tempers, and bridged conflicts that might have ignited war. And even now, at the edge of life, he would not relinquish that duty. Victoria swallowed hard, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Tell me, Albert. I will listen. I am here." He nodded slightly, gathering what little strength remained. His voice, faint but steady, began to outline the crisis. The diplomatic tensions with America, the danger of miscommunication, the precarious position of British ships in distant waters. Each word was weighted with the knowledge of consequence, and Victoria felt the immense strain on his body as he spoke. They cannot misjudge us," he whispered. "We must show restraint, but firmness." She carefully held his hand to hers, trying to absorb both the fragility of his body and the iron determination of his mind. "Yes," she whispered back, her voice firm though it shook. We will ensure it is done." A faint smile flickered across his lips. Even in weakness, he seemed satisfied that she understood, that she would act. Then, almost imperceptibly, his head sank slightly back onto the pillow. Victoria's heart lurched. She thought the moment was over, that his strength had finally failed. But he lifted a trembling hand, gesturing to the paper she still held. "Read aloud," he urged. She hesitated, tears blinding her eyes, but nodded. Taking a steadying breath, she began to read the message, carefully enunciating every word. As she did, Albert's eyes tracked each line, absorbing the information, weighing the implications, making decisions in silence. She realized then that she was no longer merely reading a letter. She was participating in the work of a man whose life had been defined by duty, by loyalty, by an unflinching commitment to the realm. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Victoria could feel the tension in his body, the effort it took just to remain upright in thought. And yet, through every struggle, he never faltered in purpose. The faint spark of life in his eyes burned steadily, illuminating the room with a brilliance that belied his frailty. Finally, he spoke again, and though the words were broken, jagged with pain, they carried certainty. Victoria, send instructions immediately, avoid escalation, preserve peace. She nodded, trying to hold back sobs. Yes, Albert. I will. I promise. Your guidance will not be wasted. A shadow of relief crossed his face. For a brief moment, the burden seemed to ease, if only slightly. His hand relaxed in hers, and she felt the faint pulse of life there, reassuring, steadying. And then, almost imperceptibly, his eyelids fluttered closed. He had given all that he could give in that moment, all that remained of his remarkable strength devoted to the kingdom, to the people, to the peace he had spent his life safeguarding. Victoria remained at his side, her fingers entwined with his, unwilling to move, unwilling to let go. She felt the weight of both grief and awe pressing down on her. The man she loved, the man who had been her partner, her confidant, her anchor, had lived and labored for the sake of duty until the very end. She whispered to him, though she knew he could no longer hear. Albert, your work is done. Rest now. Let the world wait for you. A long, shuddering breath escaped him, and she pressed her forehead to his hand, closing her eyes. For a moment, the room was still, peaceful, sacred, and then the knock came again. This time it was not urgent. It was gentle, a reminder that the world beyond these walls still moved forward, even when her heart refused to leave this room. Victoria rose slowly, carrying with her the gravity of the decisions Albert had helped guide, the weight of a kingdom now in her hands, and the quiet, enduring memory of a man who had embodied duty in its purest form. She opened the door to the attendant once more, holding herself steady. Prepare the council, she said softly, but with the quiet authority Albert had taught her. We have work to do. And as she turned back to Albert's side one last time, she felt a promise stir within her, a promise that his courage, his wisdom, and his devotion would continue to shape the future, even in his absence. The light of duty, once carried by him, would now live through her. Outside the room, the world waited, tense and uncertain. But Victoria knew that, guided by the principles he had instilled, Britain would endure. And she, standing at the edge of grief and responsibility, would carry forward with the strength and conviction of the man who had loved her, advised her, and inspired her. Prince Albert, her husband, her partner, her guide. In the quiet aftermath, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to gather what remained of her courage. The crisis would not wait, and neither could she. But she no longer felt alone. Albert's voice, his guidance, his unwavering presence in the most impossible moments would continue to resonate within her. And in that knowledge, Victoria found a fragile, resolute hope that even at the edge of despair, duty, love, and courage could endure, and that the future, however uncertain, could still be shaped by those who refused to abandon it. Victoria remained by Albert's side long after his final breath, her hand resting on his, feeling the emptiness that now filled the room. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, yet somehow sacred. Outside, the corridors of the palace whispered with movement. Footsteps of attendants, hushed voices of those who had served her husband loyally for decades. But inside this chamber, time seemed to stop. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the grief that threatened to consume her. The man who had shared her life, her burdens, her dreams, and her fears was gone. And yet, as raw and painful as that truth was, a deeper sense of responsibility pressed against her chest. She was no longer merely Victoria, a grieving wife. She was Victoria, queen, charged with the welfare of a kingdom teetering on the edge of uncertainty. Slowly, she rose, careful not to disturb the stillness around her. Her gown whispered against the polished floors as she moved toward the window, gazing out at the sprawling city beyond. London stretched into the horizon, vibrant, alive, unaware of the loss that had just occurred within the palace walls. She thought of the ministers, the council, the foreign dignitaries waiting on her word, on her guidance. Albert had always been her steady hand in times of crisis. He had counseled her through wars, treaties, and political turbulence. He had calmed the restless hearts of nations, often behind closed doors, with words measured and precise. And now, without him, she felt the full weight of the crown. But grief, she realized, could not paralyze her. Not now. Albert had taught her that duty transcended personal sorrow. His final words, faint as they were, still resonated. Preserve peace, avoid escalation. She would honor him by acting decisively, even as her heart ached. Summoning the attendant, she instructed him to prepare the council immediately. Ministers and diplomats would arrive, and she would meet them not as a widow lost in despair, but as a sovereign capable of holding the nation steady. The attendant, pale and somber, bowed and hurried to carry out her orders. Victoria returned to Albert's bedside one last time. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle kiss on his brow, whispering words meant only for him. Rest now, my love. Your work here is done. I will carry it forward. The tears she had fought to restrain finally fell freely, marking the bedspread with quiet sorrow. The room felt impossibly quiet after that. Even the flickering candlelight seemed to pause in respect. She lingered for a long moment, memorizing the lines of his face, the curve of his hand, the faint shadows of determination that still lingered in his expression. Then, with a deep breath, she straightened herself and walked to the door. The palace corridors were long and echoing, lined with portraits of ancestors who had worn the crown before her. Their faces, stern yet familiar, seemed to watch her passage. She drew strength from them, as she had done many times before, reminding herself that the weight of the crown was never hers alone. It was carried by generations of rulers, and now she would carry it in Albert's stead. The council chamber waited. The ministers were already assembled, their faces marked with anxiety and respect. They bowed as she entered, recognizing the dual weight of her grief and authority. Victoria took her place at the head of the table, folding her hands before her, the folded message from the Foreign Office lying before her. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady though layered with sorrow. We have received a report from the Foreign Office concerning an incident in American waters. Tensions are high, and missteps could have grave consequences. She paused, gathering her composure. Prince Albert has passed on his guidance for how we are to proceed. I intend to follow it carefully, to honor his wishes and preserve the peace he believed so vital. There were nods around the room, the ministers attentive, hanging on her words. She carefully outlined Albert's instructions, reading directly from the message and recalling his whispered guidance from hours before. Each word carried the weight of his wisdom, and she felt his presence beside her, almost as vividly as if he were still alive. Questions came from the ministers, concerns about strategy, timing, and the potential reactions of foreign powers. Victoria answered each one with the precision and thoughtfulness that Albert had modeled for her over decades. Her voice, though tinged with emotion, carried the authority of a monarch who understood both duty and diplomacy. As the meeting progressed, Victoria found herself drawing on every lesson Albert had taught her. His patience, his clarity of thought, his ability to weigh emotion against pragmatism. All these qualities guided her decisions. By the time the ministers began to disperse, a plan was in place that respected Albert's principles and minimized the risk of conflict. She felt a small but steady spark of relief. The kingdom was secure, for now. Once the room emptied, Victoria returned to Albert's chamber. The sunlight had shifted, casting warm patterns across the floor. She knelt again, her fingers brushing against his, and whispered, "It is done, Albert. Your guidance lives on. The peace you cherished will be protected." For the first time since his passing, she felt a faint sense of closure. Not the end of grief. Grief would always linger, but a sense that his purpose, his work, and his devotion had not been lost. They had shaped the course of a nation, and they would continue to do so through her. In the following days, Victoria moved with a measured resolve that surprised even those closest to her. She managed the crisis, sent messages to diplomats, and oversaw the implementation of Albert's instructions. At night, she returned to his chamber, sitting in quiet reflection, drawing strength from memories and from the enduring example of his life. Though the palace was filled with the bustle of advisors and attendants, Victoria often felt alone, accompanied only by the echo of Albert's voice in her mind. And yet, it was this echo that sustained her, reminding her that leadership was not about absence of fear, but about courage in the presence of it. Weeks passed. The immediate threat had subsided, tensions easing as diplomatic efforts guided by Albert's final counsel took effect. Letters arrived from foreign officials expressing cautious gratitude for the measured response, unaware of the personal sacrifice that had made it possible. Victoria read each one silently, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. One evening, as she walked through the palace gardens, she paused beside the small fountain where Albert had once liked to sit and read. The water sparkled in the fading sunlight, reflecting the sky in fleeting patterns. Victoria touched the cool stone and whispered to him, though she knew he could no longer answer. "We have endured, my love. Your vision has carried us through." The world beyond the palace moved forward, as it always did. Yet, in the quiet corners of her heart, Victoria carried Albert with her, his wisdom, his courage, his unwavering sense of duty. And she understood, with the clarity that only loss can bring, that love and leadership were inseparable, each strengthening the other. Victoria returned to her chambers that night, weary but unbroken. She would mourn, and she would remember, but she would also act. The kingdom depended on it. And in that solemn understanding, she found the first faint glimmer of peace, a promise that even in the shadow of death, the legacy of duty, devotion, and love would endure. And so, life went on, measured, purposeful, guided by the memory of a man who had believed that even in the darkest hour, one could illuminate the path forward. Victoria knew now that she, too, could bear that light, and that through her, Albert's influence would shape the course of history for generations to come. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance between mourning and duty. Victoria moved through the palace like a shadow of herself, yet each gesture was measured, purposeful. She met with ministers, addressed foreign diplomats, and reviewed correspondence, all while carrying the heavy silence of Albert's absence like a second crown. The palace, once filled with Albert's quiet counsel and reassuring presence, now felt cavernous, every corridor echoing with memories. Even in grief, she remained vigilant. The diplomatic situation in America continued to demand attention, though tensions had eased thanks to the careful instructions Albert had left. Victoria ensured that the British Navy maintained a cautious posture, sending clear signals that Britain would defend its interests but would not escalate unnecessarily. Every decision she made was guided by the lessons Albert had instilled in her over decades: patience, clarity, and an unwavering respect for principle. At night, when the halls grew quiet and the moon cast silver patterns across the palace floors, Victoria often found herself in Albert's study. The room smelled faintly of his papers and tobacco, a scent that had always comforted her. She would sit at his desk, reading his notes, reviewing treaties he had prepared, letters he had written, and drafts of speeches he had once rehearsed aloud in this very room. It was as if he had left behind a map, a guide to continue the work he had devoted his life to. One evening, a letter arrived from the United States. The handwriting was formal, almost hesitant, but it carried a tone of cautious respect. The message acknowledged Britain's measured response and expressed hope for continued peaceful relations. Victoria read it slowly, absorbing each carefully chosen word, and felt a faint relief. Albert's counsel had worked. His vision of diplomacy had prevented a potential catastrophe, even in his absence. Yet, even as she found solace in his legacy, the emptiness of the palace pressed in on her. There were quiet moments when she could not bear the thought of walking through the rooms they had shared without feeling the sharp sting of loss. The private chambers, the corridors lined with portraits, even the garden where he had walked and conversed with her, all became reminders of the man who had shaped not only the kingdom, but her very existence. Victoria knew that she could not allow herself to linger in grief forever. Her role demanded action, and the kingdom required strength. Slowly, she began to involve herself more directly in governance, reading reports, meeting with advisors, and making decisions that would affect the lives of millions. Each choice she made was informed by Albert's principles, yet she also began to recognize her own voice, her own instincts. She was no longer merely following his guidance. She was adapting it, applying it to circumstances that only she could fully understand. The council continued to rely on her decisiveness. Ministers who had once looked to Albert for leadership now turned to Victoria, and she carried herself with a quiet authority that impressed even the most seasoned diplomats. Her decisions were firm but tempered with empathy, reflecting both the influence of Albert and her own emerging wisdom. It was a delicate balance, one that required both intellect and intuition, and she rose to the challenge with a steadfast determination. In quieter moments, Victoria would retreat to the gardens. The seasons began to shift, and spring brought with it a sense of renewal. The flowers bloomed with vivid colors, and the air was filled with the scent of new growth. She would sit among the blossoms, sometimes speaking aloud to Albert, as though he could hear her. "We are enduring, my love," she would whisper. "The kingdom moves forward, and we continue our work together, even if you are not here." Her relationship with the court evolved as well. The household adapted to her strength, showing both reverence and support. Attendants, who had once taken their cues from Albert's calm authority, now deferred to Victoria's judgment, learning quickly that her resolve was unwavering. The palace began to feel alive again, not because grief had vanished, but because Victoria had chosen to carry it as a source of strength rather than a burden. Occasionally, news arrived from across the empire, reports from India, Africa, and the colonies. Each dispatch was a reminder of the vast responsibilities she now shouldered alone. Victoria read each one with care, often recalling Albert's insights, imagining how he would have approached each situation. She allowed his memory to guide her without overshadowing her own judgment, finding in that delicate interplay the source of her growing confidence. One afternoon, a messenger arrived with urgent news from the Foreign Office. A dispute at a colonial port threatened to escalate into a broader conflict. Victoria summoned the council immediately, presenting the situation with clarity and decisiveness. Drawing on Albert's past counsel, she devised a plan that prioritized diplomacy while maintaining a clear show of strength. The ministers were impressed not only by her knowledge, but by the calm authority with which she navigated the crisis. That night, as she sat alone in Albert's study, Victoria allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought of the man who had been both her partner and her guide. She remembered the nights spent in whispered conversation, the quiet walks through the gardens, the shared laughter, and the shared burdens. And she realized that Albert's presence had not left her. He had become part of her decision-making, part of the very way she saw the world. Letters and gifts of condolence continued to arrive from across Europe. Monarchs and diplomats expressed their sorrow and admiration, recognizing the immense challenge Victoria now faced. She responded with grace, her words measured, acknowledging both her grief and her determination. Each letter reinforced the network of alliances that Albert had nurtured, now maintained and strengthened under her stewardship. As the months passed, Victoria found a rhythm to her life. Mornings were dedicated to governance, afternoons to correspondence and counsel, and evenings to quiet reflection. She began to understand that leadership required both strength and vulnerability, and that her grief could coexist with her authority rather than diminish it. In this balance, she found a profound sense of purpose, a continuation of Albert's legacy in her own hands. The palace, once heavy with sorrow, began to hum with renewed life. Courtiers spoke of Victoria's growing presence with respect and awe. Diplomats noted her clarity and decisiveness. And throughout it all, Victoria carried Albert's memory like a lantern, illuminating the path forward in moments of uncertainty. Late one spring evening, as she walked through the palace corridors, Victoria paused outside the room where Albert had passed. She placed a hand on the doorframe and whispered softly, "We are moving forward, my love." Your work endures, and I will ensure it continues." The words were both a promise and a comfort, a way to honor the man who had shaped not only her life but the fate of the nation. Through the trials and decisions, the grief and the responsibilities, Victoria grew stronger. She discovered within herself a resilience she had not fully known, a capacity to carry both love and duty simultaneously. Albert's influence remained a constant guide, and in honoring him, she found her own voice, her own authority, and her own vision for the kingdom's future. And so, life continued in the palace, shaped by memory, guided by duty, and illuminated by the enduring legacy of a man whose devotion and wisdom had once steadied the course of an empire. Victoria knew that challenges would come, that decisions would still weigh heavily upon her, but she also knew that she could meet them with the strength that Albert had instilled, and with the courage that only a queen could summon. Spring gave way to summer, and the palace settled into a new rhythm under Victoria's steady hand. The grief that had once threatened to consume her became a quiet companion, tempered by purpose and by the tangible sense that Albert's guidance continued to shape the kingdom. She rose early each morning, walking through the corridors as the light spilled across marble floors, the portraits of ancestors watching her with silent approval. Each day was a careful balance of ceremony, counsel, and diplomacy, but Victoria met it with resolve, her sorrow tempered by determination. The Foreign Office remained busy. Letters arrived daily from ambassadors, ministers, and foreign dignitaries. Victoria read them all herself, her mind sharpening with each dispatch. She no longer merely followed Albert's advice. She anticipated outcomes, weighing options with his principles in mind, but applying her own judgment. She could feel his presence in every decision, sometimes a whisper of caution, sometimes a faint nudge toward boldness. But it was her hand that moved the pen, her voice that gave instruction, her mind that set policy. One afternoon, an urgent message arrived from India. A conflict over trade tariffs had escalated, threatening unrest in a key colony. Victoria convened an emergency session of the council. Ministers spoke in hushed tones, wary of overstepping or causing alarm. Victoria listened, absorbing each perspective, but she remembered Albert's insistence that action be measured yet decisive. She presented a plan that combined diplomacy, financial oversight, and a careful demonstration of authority. "The governor must act with prudence," she said, her voice steady, "but we cannot allow disorder to threaten the stability of the region. Communication must be clear, and intervention, if required, must be proportionate. There is no room for misjudgment." Her words carried weight, and the council nodded in agreement. They trusted her now, not merely as the queen grieving her husband, but as the sovereign guiding the empire. Victoria felt a subtle pride, tempered by the knowledge that it was Albert's wisdom that had sharpened her judgment, his patience that had taught her how to balance firmness with compassion. Evenings were quieter, spent in reflection or walking through the gardens. Victoria often paused by the fountain where Albert had loved to sit, tracing the stone edges with her fingers. She imagined his voice, calm and reasoned, and allowed herself to speak aloud to him. "The kingdom is stable for now, my love," she whispered. "Your guidance has carried us through, and I am doing my best to honor it." The court began to notice changes in Victoria. Her mourning was still evident in the dark fabric she wore, in the quiet moments of reflection, but it was now intertwined with a quiet authority. Ministers spoke of her decisiveness, her clarity of thought, her ability to navigate crises with calm precision. Diplomats from Europe began to correspond more frequently, expressing both respect and cautious admiration. Victoria responded with grace, maintaining a balance of formality and sincerity. One particularly hot summer afternoon, a message arrived from the United States. The tensions that had threatened war months before had subsided, but new concerns required careful attention. Victoria read the letter carefully, noting the cautious but respectful tone. She summoned the council and outlined a response that maintained Britain's authority while emphasizing peaceful resolution. As she spoke, she felt Albert's presence more keenly than ever, not in sight, but in instinct. The measured phrasing, the attention to detail, the sense of weighing each word in consequence. It was all there, embedded in the training and guidance he had imparted. Victoria realized that she was no longer acting alone. She carried him with her in thought, in principle, in judgment. That evening, she allowed herself a rare visit to Albert's private study. The room smelled faintly of paper and ink, familiar and comforting. She sat at his desk, fingers brushing across the papers and letters he had left behind. For a long time, she simply sat there, silent, absorbing the echoes of his presence. Then she began to write letters to governors, notes to ministers, instructions to diplomats. Each word was deliberate, carefully weighed, and in that act, she felt a connection to Albert stronger than any sorrow. Weeks turned into months. Victoria's grief remained, but it became a quiet strength rather than a consuming weight. She learned to navigate the court, the empire, and the press with an authority that had once belonged to both her and Albert together, now fully embodied in her alone. Her days were filled with council meetings, correspondence, and careful oversight of the empire, but she made time to walk in the gardens, to reflect on the lessons Albert had taught her, and to remember the man who had shaped not only her heart, but her ability to lead. During this period, Victoria also began to write in her journal more frequently. She recorded decisions, observations, and reflections on both governance and personal loss. Each entry was a conversation with Albert, a way of keeping his counsel alive and allowing herself to process the depth of her grief while maintaining focus on her duties. She discovered that writing, much like speaking aloud to him in the quiet of the palace, allowed her to find clarity, to plan with precision, and to anchor herself amid the constant demands of rulership. One morning, Victoria received news that a neighboring European nation was experiencing political unrest. She called an urgent meeting with her advisors and outlined a course of action that emphasized diplomatic engagement and careful negotiation, rather than military posturing. She cited Albert's counsel repeatedly, reminding herself and the ministers of the principles he had championed: prudence, foresight, and measured strength. The ministers listened attentively, recognizing that her leadership now carried both the wisdom of Albert and her own emerging decisiveness. By autumn, the empire was steady, and Victoria had begun to establish a rhythm of governance that integrated her grief, her memory of Albert, and her own judgment. She understood that leadership required not only intellect, but emotional resilience, the ability to act decisively even when personal loss weighed heavily on the heart. And in that understanding, she discovered a strength she had not fully recognized before, a resilience shaped by love, loss, and duty intertwined. Late one evening, as she walked through the palace gardens under the soft glow of the moon, Victoria paused by the fountain. The water rippled gently in the night air, reflecting the stars above. She knelt, pressing her hands to the stone edge, and whispered softly, "We have endured, my love. Your guidance has shaped the path, and I am carrying it forward." For the first time since Albert's passing, she felt a sense of completion, not of grief ending, but of purpose fulfilled, of legacy honored, of duty maintained. Victoria returned to the palace with renewed resolve. She understood that the empire's stability depended not on one individual alone, but on the careful, deliberate work of a sovereign willing to act with both courage and wisdom. And she knew that Albert's memory would remain with her always, a source of strength, guidance, and inspiration as she faced the challenges yet to come. The seasons continued to shift, but Victoria moved with the confidence of a queen who had been tested and tempered by loss. Her decisions, measured yet resolute, reflected both her own emerging voice and the enduring influence of the man who had shaped her life and her reign. And in the quiet moments, when the palace was still and the world beyond seemed distant, she would sit in Albert's study or by the fountain, remembering the man who had guided her, taught her, and loved her. And in doing so, she found the courage to carry forward, to lead, and to shape the future of the kingdom with grace, strength, and unwavering devotion. Even in his absence, Prince Albert's presence had never truly left her. His legacy lived in her decisions, in her voice, and in the steady resolve that now defined her reign. And Victoria knew, as she had always known, that love, duty, and the quiet strength of character could endure, even across the vast gulf of time and loss, shaping the course of history long after the moment of parting. The months that followed became a study in resilience for Victoria. Each day brought its own trials. Reports of unrest in distant colonies, diplomatic entanglements with European powers, and the ongoing management of her own court. Yet she approached each challenge with a determination that seemed almost unshakable. She relied on Albert's teachings, his meticulous approach to governance, and his patience, but she also began to discover the contours of her own judgment. Victoria spent mornings reviewing reports from governors across the empire. She scrutinized trade disputes in India, agricultural crises in Africa, and tensions in the Caribbean colonies. Each dispatch reminded her of the delicate balance of power Albert had often spoken about, the constant tension between strength and diplomacy, action and restraint. She would often pause, imagining his voice in her ear, measure carefully, anticipate consequences, preserve the peace. Those words, though unspoken, guided her decisions with steady authority. Afternoons were for council meetings. Ministers who had once approached Albert with deference and caution now deferred to Victoria herself. They were often surprised by her clarity and decisiveness, by her ability to weigh complex information and issue instructions that were both firm and nuanced. She maintained Albert's legacy of careful diplomacy, but added her own sensibility, an intuition for people, for the subtleties of communication, and for the political undercurrents that a monarch must navigate. In these months, Victoria became increasingly aware of the profound influence Albert had had, not just on her, but on the kingdom. His counsel had shaped the empire's policies, moderated disputes, and often prevented conflict. Now, in his absence, she realized that she carried both the burden and the opportunity of continuing that work. It was no longer enough to mourn. She had to act, and she did so with deliberate precision. Late in the afternoons, she would retreat to Albert's private study, the room filled with the scent of paper, ink, and memories. She would sit at his desk, reviewing letters he had written, reading his notes on treaties, and examining the correspondence he had left behind. In those moments, she felt him beside her, a quiet presence that guided her through decisions. The weight of grief was still there, but it was tempered by the sense of purpose she derived from his teachings. One day, news arrived from the United States that required her immediate attention. A dispute over shipping rights threatened to escalate tensions once more. Victoria summoned her counsel without hesitation. She reviewed the situation carefully, noting the reports from both sides, and consulted the correspondence Albert had left regarding similar incidents. Drawing on that guidance, she devised a response that was firm but diplomatic, emphasizing Britain's position while minimizing the risk of provocation. "The Americans must understand that our interests are not negotiable," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "But we must also demonstrate a willingness to resolve this peacefully. Any escalation could have consequences far beyond this port." Her counsel listened intently, impressed by the clarity and foresight in her instructions. Letters were drafted, messages sent, and by the end of the week, tensions had eased. Victoria allowed herself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. The guidance Albert had provided had shaped her actions, yes, but her own judgment and decisiveness had carried them forward. Evenings were quieter, filled with reflection. Victoria often walked in the gardens, past the fountain where Albert had enjoyed reading and conversation. She would pause, placing her hand on the stone edge, and whisper to him, "We are navigating this together, my love. Your wisdom guides me still." Sometimes she would sit in the shaded alcoves of the palace grounds, imagining conversations with him, allowing herself both grief and solace. The court slowly adapted to this new rhythm. Courtiers who had once looked to Albert for direction now recognized Victoria as a sovereign capable of holding her own, guided by grief yet strengthened by it. Ambassadors took note as well, corresponding with the palace with a newfound respect for the Queen's authority. Victoria responded with grace and intelligence, honoring Albert's legacy while asserting her own leadership. In the quiet of the palace, she also began to write more frequently in her journal. These entries were more than records. They were conversations with Albert, reflections on the decisions she had made, and meditations on the weight of leadership. Writing allowed her to process both her sorrow and her sense of responsibility, keeping Albert's guidance alive while shaping her own approach to governance. Winter approached, bringing shorter days and longer nights. The palace, once bright with summer light, now seemed to hold its breath under the gray skies. Victoria moved through the halls with the same disciplined purpose, attending to reports, council meetings, and correspondence. Yet she allowed herself moments of quiet, sitting by the windows with a blanket around her shoulders, watching snow fall across the gardens where Albert had once walked. It was during one such evening that a particularly delicate diplomatic situation arose. A neighboring European power was facing internal unrest that threatened to spill over into British interests. Victoria convened her council, reviewing intelligence reports and assessing potential outcomes. She drew upon Albert's principles, forethought, prudence, and measured action, but she also trusted her own instincts. After careful deliberation, she issued instructions that balanced firmness with diplomacy, emphasizing engagement while maintaining clear boundaries. The council responded with respect and confidence. Victoria had earned their trust not through force or command alone, but through wisdom, clarity, and the ability to navigate complexity with calm authority. She recognized that Albert's influence had prepared her for this, but that her own judgment now stood as a complement to his legacy. Victoria continued to maintain this balance through the following months. She managed crises in distant colonies, reviewed trade agreements, and corresponded with foreign leaders. She spent her evenings in reflection, in the study, or in the gardens, maintaining the connection to Albert that had become a source of guidance and comfort. Each decision was a tribute to him, each action a continuation of the principles he had embodied. In the palace, life settled into a new rhythm. Courtiers, ministers, and diplomats all adjusted to the reality of Albert's absence, recognizing Victoria's steady hand and thoughtful leadership. The empire remained stable, guided by a queen who had learned to carry both grief and authority with equal measure. Victoria's sorrow remained, but it had transformed into a quiet strength, a companion that reminded her of the love, wisdom, and guidance that had shaped her life. Late one evening, as the winter snow blanketed the gardens, Victoria paused outside Albert's chamber. She placed her hand on the doorframe, whispering softly, "We have endured, my love. Your wisdom lives on through me, and I will continue the work we began together." For the first time since his passing, she felt a sense of quiet fulfillment, a recognition that grief and duty could coexist, and that through her, Albert's influence would continue to guide the kingdom. With each passing day, Victoria grew more confident in her role. She understood that leadership was not the absence of sorrow, but the ability to act decisively despite it. She had learned to carry Albert's memory as a source of strength, applying his principles while trusting her own judgment. The empire remained steady, guided by a sovereign shaped by love, loss, and the enduring influence of a man who had devoted his life to duty. Victoria knew that challenges would continue to arise, that crises would test her resolve, and that decisions would weigh heavily upon her. Yet she also knew that she was not alone. She carried Albert's guidance with her in every action, every thought, every decision. And in that knowledge, she found the courage to face the future with confidence, grace, and unwavering devotion, not just to the empire, but to the memory of the man who had shaped her life and her reign. The seasons turned, one into the next, and Victoria continued to lead with clarity and purpose. She navigated the complexities of empire with the wisdom Albert had instilled in her and the judgment she had honed through experience. In the quiet moments, she reflected on the love and partnership they had shared, and she allowed that memory to strengthen her. She understood that grief would remain, but it had become a source of guidance, not weakness, a reminder of what had been lost and a beacon for what must be preserved. And so, the empire endured. The kingdoms, the colonies, and the courts continued under her steady hand. Victoria carried Albert's memory not as a shadow, but as a light, a source of wisdom, courage, and unwavering dedication. Through grief, through duty, through the long and often lonely nights, she had learned that love and leadership were inseparable, that loss could coexist with strength, and that the legacy of a devoted life could endure beyond death, shaping the course of history for generations to come. The air in the council chamber felt heavier than usual, as if the very walls held their breath. Victoria stood at the head of the table, the folded papers of correspondence spread before her like a map of the world. The dispute with the European power had escalated faster than anyone had predicted. Rumors of troop movements, intercepted messages, and secret alliances threatened to undo months of careful diplomacy. She could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on her. But beneath it, a familiar clarity emerged, the same clarity Albert had embodied in moments of crisis. Their envoy demands immediate concessions, one of the ministers said, voice tight. They claim Britain is overstepping its authority in the colonies. If we refuse, he let the thought hang in the air. Victoria raised a hand, steady and commanding. We will not give in to threats, she said, her voice firm but controlled. But neither will we provoke conflict unnecessarily. We must respond with strength and reason. Show them that Britain is unshakable, yet willing to negotiate in good faith. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Every minister knew that the stakes were enormous, not just for the empire, but for the fragile balance of power in Europe and America. Victoria drew on every lesson Albert had taught her. Anticipate the opponent, foresee their moves, remain calm when others falter, and make decisions rooted in principle rather than impulse. Hours passed as messages were drafted, revised, and sent. Victoria read each one aloud, ensuring precision, tone, and intention. She thought of Albert, imagining his faint nod of approval, his quiet insistence that clarity and patience could prevail even in the most dangerous moments. Her heart beat faster as the last message was sealed and dispatched. A final statement of Britain's position, firm, uncompromising, yet tempered with the offer of peaceful resolution. That evening, as she stepped into the palace gardens to clear her mind, news arrived. The rival European power had responded. The tension that had gripped the council for weeks, the threat that had loomed like a storm, was beginning to shift. Their response was cautious, diplomatic, and unexpectedly conciliatory. Victoria allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in months, the world seemed to tilt back toward balance. But relief was short-lived. That night, as the palace grew quiet and the flickering candlelight cast long shadows along the hallways, a messenger arrived with another note, sealed with the unmistakable mark of the United States government. Victoria opened it, expecting routine acknowledgement or cautious diplomacy. Instead, the letter carried startling intelligence, evidence of a secret plan within the European power to use the American dispute as a pretext for a covert naval maneuver, a move that could have escalated into war before her careful diplomacy had even taken effect. Her pulse quickened. The peace she thought had been secured teetered on a knife edge. Victoria called an emergency council at once. Ministers were gathered, their faces pale with the realization of the hidden danger. Victoria spoke with urgency, recounting the intelligence, outlining the potential consequences, and proposing a swift, decisive response. We must act immediately, she said. Delay could be catastrophic. Prepare our naval commanders. Send urgent instructions to the colonies. But do so with discretion, We cannot reveal our knowledge of their plan or risk provoking them prematurely. Messages were dispatched, orders executed, and the empire moved with silent, precise efficiency. Victoria watched every step, feeling the adrenaline of crisis surging through her. The palace was a hive of controlled chaos, each servant, minister, and officer performing their duty with exacting care. She could almost hear Albert's voice in her mind. Stay calm. Every detail matters. Trust your judgment, and the outcome will follow. By dawn, reports arrived. The European power's covert maneuver had been intercepted, thwarted before it could be executed. The crisis that had threatened to erupt into war was resolved, thanks to careful planning and quick action. Relief washed over Victoria in a wave she had not felt in months. She allowed herself to step outside, breathing in the crisp morning air, feeling the empire's pulse steady once more. And then came the twist. An unexpected message from a source she had not anticipated, a confidential report from within the palace itself. A loyal aide, recently assigned to Albert's private office, had uncovered a series of letters hidden in his desk. Letters revealing that the European power had not acted alone. There had been a network of secret sympathizers within Britain itself, officials who had been feeding information to foreign interests, attempting to manipulate the dispute for personal gain. The revelation shocked the council and sent a chill through Victoria. The danger had not just been external. It had been inside her own palace, within the very walls she thought she knew. Victoria's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain composed. She instructed that the matter be investigated discreetly, that loyalty be verified, and that any conspirators be removed with precision. She understood now, more clearly than ever, that leadership required vigilance, not just in diplomacy, but within one's own court. The empire's safety depended on her ability to see both far and near, to anticipate threats from all directions. As the investigation unfolded over the following days, Victoria maintained her public composure while quietly ensuring the integrity of the palace and its officials. One by one, the conspirators were identified and removed. Their plans foiled, the empire remained secure. Yet the experience left a lingering awareness of fragility, the knowledge that even in victory, danger could hide in unexpected places. Late at night, Victoria returned once more to Albert's study. She sat by his desk, touching the worn wood as if seeking comfort from his memory. "We have survived this, my love," she whispered. "The empire stands, and the threats are neutralized. But the work never truly ends." She paused, drawing strength from the quiet room, from the legacy of wisdom and duty he had left behind. For the first time, she felt the weight of both grief and triumph. She had faced threats that could have toppled nations, guided the empire through crises with intelligence and resolve, and discovered the depth of loyalty and betrayal within her own palace. And through it all, Albert's guidance had been her unseen hand, a source of clarity and courage. Yet even as the night grew still, a new letter arrived. This one unsigned, cryptic, delivered in the quiet hours by a courier who disappeared without explanation. Victoria opened it with trepidation. The words were few, almost taunting. "You have preserved peace, but peace is not enough. Something worse waits, closer than you know." Victoria's breath caught. The world she had fought to stabilize, the empire she had guided through peril, might yet face a new and hidden threat. The story she had thought concluded, the climax she had endured, had only revealed the beginning of a deeper mystery. She clutched the letter tightly, feeling the familiar surge of determination. Albert's lessons had prepared her for crises, but she now realized that vigilance, courage, and resolve would never truly end. And as the palace lay in darkness around her, Victoria understood with sharp clarity that history was never static, and that leadership required not only the courage to face what is known, but the wisdom to confront what lurked in the shadows, unseen, awaiting its moment. Victoria sat at her desk long into the night, the cryptic note still clutched in her hand. The words echoed in her mind, refusing to fade. "Something worse waits, closer than you know." She stared out of the window at the moonlit gardens, the familiar fountain reflecting the pale light, a place once imbued with Albert's quiet presence. She could almost see him there, waiting with steady calm, urging her to stay composed, to think carefully before acting. Her first instinct was fear, a surge that prickled along her skin, but she forced it aside. Fear had never guided Albert, and it would not guide her either. She set the letter aside, its meaning unclear, but its urgency undeniable. If someone inside the palace had threatened the empire once, it was possible they, or others, remained undetected, plotting in silence. She needed information, intelligence, and clarity. Victoria summoned her most trusted aides. Those who had remained loyal during the previous weeks of upheaval were called together quietly, away from the ears of the full council. She read the letter aloud, her voice steady, her tone measured. "This is not merely a threat," she said, eyes sweeping the room. "It is a warning, and we must treat it with the seriousness it demands. We cannot allow complacency to undo the work we have done." Questions came immediately. Who could have sent the letter? How had they gained knowledge of the recent events? Was it an external plot, or something internal once again? Victoria listened, noting every theory, every concern, and then spoke with the precision and authority that had carried her through the prior crisis. "We will investigate quietly, systematically, and without alarming the palace unnecessarily," she said. "No action will be taken based on assumptions. Every detail will be verified, every source questioned. Only then will we decide how to act." The aides dispersed, moving like shadows through the palace, discreetly questioning staff, reviewing recent correspondence, and examining access points. Victoria remained at her desk, reviewing reports, tracing patterns, and reconstructing events in her mind. Every detail mattered. Every minor oversight could be a clue. She could feel Albert's influence guiding her, a faint but insistent presence in the logic of strategy and the patience of observation. Days passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Victoria received reports of unusual meetings in the city, coded letters intercepted from unknown couriers, and subtle hints of influence among foreign diplomats. The investigation was painstaking, requiring precision, discretion, and a calm mind. Yet she remained unshaken, fueled by both grief and determination, and by the knowledge that Albert had entrusted her with the responsibility to protect not only the empire, but its very integrity. Then, late one evening, a breakthrough came. An aide returned with news of a hidden correspondence, letters that suggested a faction within the palace itself had been attempting to manipulate events for personal gain. The same network that had been foiled months ago had never been fully dismantled. Some of its members had gone underground, quietly influencing foreign contacts and attempting to destabilize Victoria's leadership. The discovery shocked even her experienced mind. The danger was closer than she had feared. Victoria called an urgent meeting of her inner circle. The aides and ministers gathered, their faces tense but trusting in her guidance. She laid out the evidence, reading the hidden letters aloud and explaining the pattern of influence that had been uncovered. Every step, every connection was traced with care. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation settled in. "This is no longer simply diplomacy or foreign intrigue," Victoria said firmly. "This is a direct threat to the sovereignty of the empire and to the stability we have fought so hard to maintain. We cannot act recklessly, but neither can we hesitate. Every conspirator must be identified and contained." The next hours became a blur of strategy and action. Victoria coordinated with loyal ministers, officers of the palace guard, and intelligence sources, setting in motion a series of discreet investigations and security measures. Spies and couriers, previously unnoticed, were tracked. Correspondence was monitored with precision. Every suspected plot was carefully unraveled, revealing a network more extensive than anyone had anticipated. And then came the moment of confrontation. Victoria arranged a discreet assembly of the palace officials implicated in the network, ensuring that loyal guards were strategically positioned. The accused arrived, confident in their secrecy, unaware that their actions had been traced with methodical precision. Victoria faced them directly, her expression calm, yet unyielding. "You have acted against the crown," she said, voice low but authoritative. "You have attempted to manipulate foreign powers, undermine the stability of the empire, and threaten the trust placed in this palace. Your actions have been discovered, your plans foiled. Speak now, and there may be mercy. Hide nothing, for we know more than you realize." The room trembled with tension. Some stammered, some tried to deflect, but the weight of evidence was undeniable. Victoria listened, her gaze sharp, allowing no interruption of her authority. The network was exposed, their influence severed, and the threat neutralized. For the first time since Albert's death, she felt the full satisfaction of control, of victory, of the empire's security restored under her hand. Yet even as the conspirators were removed, a final, unexpected twist emerged. In the stacks of letters and intercepted messages, Victoria discovered one envelope that had gone unnoticed. It bore no signature, no seal, but its contents sent a chill through her. The handwriting was familiar, eerily so. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the lines. The words were deliberate and precise. "You have removed the threats you can see, but the true danger has always been within. Look closer. There is someone you trust who has not yet revealed their hand." Her pulse quickened. The revelation was subtle, terrifying in its implications. Even in victory, even with the network dismantled, the palace still held secrets. Someone close, someone she believed loyal, might yet be the source of the deepest betrayal. The shadow that had haunted the empire had not been fully dispelled. Victoria folded the letter carefully, her mind racing with possibilities. She realized that Albert's lessons of vigilance, prudence, and foresight were more necessary than ever. The challenges of leadership were unending, and even triumph carried the seeds of future crises. Yet she did not falter. Her grief had strengthened her, her experience had sharpened her judgment, and her determination had become unbreakable. As the palace settled into the quiet of night, Victoria sat alone in Albert's study, the letter unopened on her desk. She traced her fingers over the wood, imagining his calm presence beside her. "We have endured, my love," she whispered, "and yet the path is never truly safe. But I will face it. I will protect the empire. I will not fail." Outside, the city slept, unaware of the near catastrophe that had been averted, unaware of the hidden network that had sought to destabilize the crown. Inside the palace, the queen prepared for the next challenge, knowing that vigilance, courage, and wisdom would always be required. And in that moment, Victoria understood with stark clarity that history was never truly complete. Every resolution contained the seeds of new intrigue, every victory the shadow of unseen danger. Leadership was eternal, and so was her resolve. The empire had survived crisis, conspiracies, and threats, and under her hand, it would endure. But the final twist lingered like a whisper in the dark. The person she trusted most might yet hold the key to the empire's next test. Victoria rose from the desk, her eyes fixed on the gardens where the moonlight shimmered across the fountain. She drew in a deep, steadying breath. The threats had been met, the conspiracies exposed, but the shadow remained. She would face it, as she had faced everything else, with intelligence, courage, and the quiet strength that had guided her since Albert's last whispered counsel. And for the first time, she allowed herself a small, resolute smile. The empire had survived her grief. It had survived the threats. And no matter what secrets remained hidden, Victoria knew one thing: she would not fail. Not now, not ever. Victoria walked through the palace corridors the next morning with a sense of measured calm. The conspirators had been removed, the empire's stability restored, and the immediate threats neutralized. Yet the lingering knowledge of the hidden hand, someone she trusted who might still hold secrets, kept her cautious, aware that vigilance was a constant duty. She understood now that leadership was not a moment of triumph followed by ease, but a steady commitment to watchfulness, wisdom, and resilience. She convened her council once more, this time not in crisis, but in quiet reflection. Ministers gathered with relief in their eyes, grateful that the immediate danger had passed. Victoria reviewed each decision made in recent weeks, acknowledging the council's diligence and loyalty while emphasizing the lessons learned. "The empire is strong because of careful action," she said, her voice calm, yet imbued with quiet authority. "But strength alone is not enough. Loyalty, vigilance, and attention to detail. These are the shields that protect us from the unseen. Never forget that." The council nodded, understanding the subtle caution in her words. They had witnessed her navigate crises with intelligence and clarity, balancing external threats with internal intrigue. For the first time, many realized that the queen they had long served as a figurehead was now a sovereign whose intellect, patience, and emotional strength were unmatched. Victoria returned to Albert's study in the afternoon. The room was quiet, the familiar scent of parchment and ink comforting. She sat at his desk and carefully reviewed the letters and reports that had been gathered during the investigation. She reflected on the depth of betrayal that had been uncovered and on the resilience and loyalty of those who had acted in service of the crown. Every detail, every action had shaped the resolution of the crisis. And in that reflection, Victoria felt a profound sense of closure. She also wrote in her journal, a habit she had cultivated since Albert's passing. Each entry was a way to honor his legacy while recording her own growth. She wrote of the conspiracies thwarted, the foreign disputes resolved, and the lessons she had learned about leadership, vigilance, and the subtle complexities of trust. She allowed herself to record the uncertainty she still felt about the hidden element within the palace, knowing that acknowledging fear was not weakness, but a necessary part of wisdom. Days turned into weeks, and the empire settled back into its normal rhythms. Trade resumed without disruption. Correspondence with foreign powers returned to routine channels, and the colonies reported stability. Victoria maintained a careful watch, reviewing intelligence and communications with diligence, but the immediate tension that had once filled the palace halls began to fade. The sense of crisis was replaced by purposeful governance, a measured pace that reflected both her authority and her commitment to Albert's principles. In the quiet evenings, she walked through the gardens, past the fountain where Albert had spent so many hours. She paused often, placing her hands on the cool stone, whispering to him in the soft glow of twilight. "We have endured, my love," she said softly. "The empire is safe, the threats have been met, and the work we began together continues. I hope I have made you proud." The act of speaking aloud, of imagining his presence, gave her a sense of comfort and closure she had not felt in months. Victoria also made time to reconnect with the palace staff who had shown loyalty and courage. She acknowledged their dedication, rewarding those who had acted with integrity and reinforcing the values she wished to instill in the empire's administration. The subtle rebuilding of trust within her inner circle was as critical as the public victories. It ensured that the palace would remain resilient against any future threats, seen or unseen. As the weeks passed, Victoria began to find moments of quiet joy. She attended public ceremonies with renewed grace, overseeing the empire with a careful balance of authority and compassion. She corresponded with foreign dignitaries with precision, her responses clear, measured, and thoughtful. The crisis had tested her in ways she could not have anticipated, but had also revealed her capacity to lead with intelligence, emotional depth, and unwavering commitment. In private, she often reflected on the lessons Albert had imparted, not just about diplomacy or governance, but about life, duty, and love. His guidance had shaped her judgment, strengthened her resolve, and given her the tools to confront crises with clarity. She realized that his influence would remain with her, not as a shadow, but as a source of enduring insight that would guide every decision she made. The empire, now stable, offered Victoria the chance to focus on long-term governance and legacy. She reviewed policies, strengthened alliances, and ensured that trade, infrastructure, and administration were managed efficiently. Her leadership had evolved from reliance on counsel to confident, autonomous decision-making, informed by experience, insight, and the principles Albert had instilled in her. Yet even as she found peace in the restored order, Victoria remained mindful of the hidden threats. The anonymous letter she had received during the climax reminded her that vigilance was never complete, that leadership required constant attention to both external and internal factors. She accepted that uncertainty was part of the role, that even in resolution, careful watchfulness must persist. In time, the palace resumed its rhythms, the empire secured under her steady hand. Victoria's confidence as a sovereign was matched only by her compassion and insight. She balanced the demands of governance with quiet reflection, honoring Albert's memory while asserting her own voice. Her decisions were precise, her actions deliberate, and her awareness of the nuances of power deepened with each day. On a quiet evening, Victoria stood once more by the fountain. The water rippled softly under the light of the setting sun. She traced her fingers along the stone, thinking of Albert, of the crises they had weathered together, and of the challenges she had now faced alone. She felt both the weight of responsibility and the fulfillment of duty, a combination that was uniquely hers. "The empire endures," she whispered to the water, to the memory of Albert, and to herself. "And so does the strength we build together. Nothing can diminish that. We have learned, we have endured, and we have prevailed." Victoria turned back toward the palace with a sense of quiet certainty. The threats had been met, conspiracies revealed, and the empire secured. Lessons had been learned, trust restored, and authority reaffirmed. She had navigated the storm of intrigue and danger, balancing grief, duty, and leadership with grace. Though the shadow of uncertainty remained, it no longer held the power to paralyze her. She knew that vigilance, courage, and wisdom would guide her forward, as they always had. Albert's influence, the lessons of experience, and her own emerging authority combined to create a sovereign capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. And as Victoria walked through the palace halls that evening, the soft light of lamps casting long shadows, she understood fully what it meant to lead. To govern was not simply to maintain order, but to act with clarity, foresight, and compassion, to balance strength with understanding, to navigate both seen and unseen threats. She had done this, and she would continue to do so, for the empire, for her people, and for the memory of the man who had guided her through both life and loss. The story of crisis, betrayal, and triumph had reached its conclusion. The empire was secure, the conspiracies resolved, and the queen's authority firmly established. Victoria had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable than ever, her grief transformed into purpose, her loss into enduring insight. The lessons of loyalty, vigilance, and duty would remain, a guiding light for her reign and a testament to the love and partnership she had shared with Albert. And in that quiet, reflective moment, Victoria understood the ultimate truth. Leadership was not measured by the absence of danger or the ease of days, but by the courage to face the unknown, the clarity to act decisively, and the resilience to endure no matter what shadows might linger. She had faced them all, and she would continue to do so, unwavering, steadfast, and guided always by the principles that Albert had lived and loved.